what the dynamic of voting was and what your expectations are now. So we'll turn it over to you.
Hello, not so good in English, but I will try. The most problem that we have on these elections was that it was not open elections for us. It was very difficult to have a good campaign. We have not the same situation with the opposition candidates and the candidates of the Единая Россия and United Russia. For example, if you want to create a meeting with the people, you'd like to have if you need to create a meeting with people, you have to take a paper from the administration, but you can't take this paper without if you are opposition. It's my main problem. For example, the next problem was signature for the election on. Difficult. Maybe you have a translator from Russian to English. Is it all right?
Yeah, somebody can translate for you.
Я тебе помогу, Андрей. Я помогу.
Спасибо, да. Главная проблема была, что выборы не были открытыми для оппозиции.
The main problem was burdens that were created for the opposition.
Для примера, что изначально разные политические партии находились в разных условиях. Для примера, партия Парнас в Петербурге, мы за все время в некоторых районах не могли согласовать ни одного публичного мероприятия.
Different political parties, they had different starting positions. For example, Parnas political party cannot get permissions for any of the public events or meetings with constituents.
В то время как представители Единой России, партии власти, фактически не просто получали это согласование, но и где-то даже нарушали те строгие законы, которые были предоставлены, которые стоят у нас сейчас в проведении избирательной кампании.
And for United Russia candidates, they not just was getting any permissions that they needed. Sometimes they even violated their own rules and were meeting with people without any permissions and in government facilities.
Если мы говорим про размещение политической рекламы, если мы говорим про покупку билбордов, покупку какой-то публичной рекламы, то, опять-таки, даже коммерческие предприятия ставят блок для политических партий оппозиционного толка, в то время как весь город завешен рекламой провластных партий, и в этом плане тоже есть четкие ограничения по политическим составляющим.
Commercial companies that were putting billboards, ran public advertisement, whatever, they were blackmailed not to take money from the opposition so that no advertisement would be made.
Если говорить про сам день голосования, который проходил непосредственно, то на самих участках с точки зрения проведения самого дня голосования было достаточно спокойно, и грубых нарушений в день голосования пока в Петербурге не было. Но при подсчете голосов... Да.
To the contrary to the previous experiences, in the particular voting day, everything was relatively calm and there was no major violations.
Но при подсчете голосов непосредственно, когда началась уже обработка бюллетеней, это, наверное, худший, в моем опыте, даже по сравнению с 2011 годом, преступления, нарушения, которые были.
But during the counting, in particular in St. Petersburg, the violations were worst ever, even worse than in 2011.
Мы сталкивались с давлением наблюдателей, сталкивались с ситуацией, когда опять комиссии убегали с неподписанными протоколами, не готовыми бюллетенями, не готовыми документами, когда уже подписанные протоколы снова переписывались, и данные, которые вводились в газвыборы, они отличались от тех, которые были на участках.
We encountered numerous cases when observers were pressured, pushed away from the voting stations, when the result protocols were rewritten by members of Electoral Commission, when the results that were put in the official electronic system were different from the ones that were actually counted.
Все это привело к тому, что особенно в округах, мы говорим про округах выборов законодательного собрания, результат по целому ряду участков не совпадал с тем, которые видели наблюдатели на момент подсчета голосов впервые.
Especially that was the case during the regional part of the elections. In St. Petersburg, they ran two elections in parallel, federal elections and the regional elections. And those candidates who were running for the regional assembly, their results were written primarily.
Ну и, конечно же, наверное, стоит подчеркнуть момент, что все это возможно было, наверное, в связи с тем, что и в Петербурге, и в Москве, и, значит, в Московской области была очень низкая явка.
And that's all was made possible because the turnover was extremely low. The turnout, the turnout in St. Petersburg was the lowest in the country.
Власть всеми способами пыталась как снизить явку, так и, может быть, снизить интерес к выборам. За счет этого у нас было меньшее количество сторонников, которые пришли на участки, и меньшее количество наблюдателей.
And that was conscious strategy of the authorities to decrease interest to these elections, to make sure that people would stay home. And that affected the results of the opposition a lot.
Ну, в целом, если завершаем, можно сказать, что в целом эти выборы скорее еще больше, может быть, как-то нанесли удар по оппозиционным силам, особенно тем, которые участвовали в выборах, и тем, которые призывали участвовать в выборах, и сильно, скажем так, добавило аргументов тем, кто изначально выступал за бойкот.
To conclude the way those elections were implemented, it actually gave new arguments for those who are to boycott the electoral system in Russia, to the radicals, to those who want to abstain from the voting process, and another major blow for the opposition and for the democracy in Russia in general.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrei. If you don't mind, can you stay on the line so that if there are questions later on, you can answer? Okay.
Can I actually ask a question?
Sure. Now?
Андрей, результаты там посчитаны. У вас насколько отличаются результаты региональных выборов от федеральных? Есть серьезные расхождения между региональными данными и федеральными? I'm asking whether the results of the regional elections are different from the federal, because in numerous regions they are seriously different, and that's the indication that possible violations and fraud could actually happen.
Петербург традиционно демократический город, здесь высокое влияние демократического электората, и в отличие от федеральных выборов, существенный процент набрала партия «Яблоко», порядка 9% сейчас у них.
St. Petersburg is traditionally a very democratic place, and in St. Petersburg, Yabloko is staying pretty high with 9-point-something% of the vote.
В то время как на федеральном уровне 1,5%, и партия Роста за счет Оксаны Дмитриевой здесь, получается, набрала порядка, по-моему, 11% сейчас, в то время как по России у них 1,8%.
Also, so-called Party of Growth, that's a new liberal but loyal to Putin liberal political party, because of the popular Oksana Dmitrieva, one of the popular deputies, already former deputies of Russian Duma, received 11% in St. Petersburg.
Ну, можно сказать, как, естественно, партия «Единая Россия» набрала...
Андрей, у меня не в этом вопрос, у меня вопрос, поскольку у вас были двое выборов параллельно, региональные и федеральные. Вот результаты конкретно по Питеру, подсчет голосов по федеральным выборам и по региональным, одинаковые цифры или разные?
Совпадают.
Совпадают, да?
Да.
Okay, Andrei says that numbers on the federal elections and regional elections in St. Petersburg are the same.
Okay, thanks. Andrei, please hang on the line if you can, and let's move over now to Evgeny Minchenko.
Hello?
Здравствуйте. Go ahead.
Hello?
Жень, привет.
Do you hear me? Привет, Илья.
Да, слышим тебя хорошо.
So I need to make some kind of statement, or are you going to ask me any questions? So how it works better?
Well, I guess it would be helpful if you could just give us your perspective on the conduct of the elections, on how fair they seemed, both in terms of the campaign and the counting, if there were any anomalies or surprises, if there were any regional variations, and just what your expectations are now.
Okay. So I want to apologize. I don't have much of time. I have about 10-15 minutes, unfortunately, because there are very hot days. So I can tell you that I did not see any big problems with the election problems, and so I've heard some a part of Andrei Pivovarov's speech. So I did not see any problems with advertisement or some campaigning for rallies of any oppositional candidates, and actually it was quite free. So talking about election day, so we saw on Russian state TV some problems, and I know that some criminal charges are already on. So, and I know that there is a position of Central Election Committee that all those cases have to be investigated. So, for me, maybe the result of United Russia Party was unpredictable, because my idea was it will be less than 50%, but it became higher. I guess maybe it's because of a few reasons. One is quite low turnout, less than 50%. And maybe the loyal voters came to the election to the poll stations. So the second reason is that Vladimir Putin supported very hardly United Russia in the last weeks before the elections. He had a meeting with the members of United Russia Party, and they used his name in the advertisement. So, and Putin has an approval rating more than 80%. So, and also I guess that candidates in a constituencies helped to the party rating, because United Russia had a candidate in more than 200 constituencies. So the candidates helped to the party results. Also, I would say that United Russia had a candidate in 39 regional parliaments by party lists and constituencies as well. And they had a governors. We had about 8 governors elections, and 6 of them were direct. So I guess it could have some kind of cumulative effect. So if there were some specific issues with the counting, I would not say that were higher than it was in 2011. I guess that if we compare it with an elections of 2011, I would say that those elections were more competitive, more legitimate, and more honest. So, but I guess that, of course, that could be some issues, but I would not say that they had a huge impact on the results of those elections.
Okay, thanks. Could you say something a little bit about the lead up to the elections and how the media messages were structured on the part of United Russia and the other parties, and just how much access to especially the television that the opposition parties had?
So actually, I guess they had almost equal, but I would say that, of course, that parliamentary parties had a preferences. So, and of course, the leaders and the parliament members of the oppositional parties had preferences to visit TV before the elections, but at the same time, Grigory Yavlinsky had a lot of opportunities. Boris Titov had a lot of opportunities. Um, if we are talking about an election campaign as itself, so we had a debate time and we had a time on television, and so it was like shock when this guy from Parnas party, Maltsev, said that so we have to punish Putin, we have to impeach him, and so it was on state television, and there were no any censorship about that, and so actually this party of personal Putin haters, they received less than 1% of the votes. So this strategy was not effective, but they had an opportunity to represent this strategy. So I would say that problem with so-called liberal opposition was with the wrong message, with the wrong strategy and wrong campaigning. So, for example, I guess that the first term of Yabloko party list was good. So, for example, Galina Shershina, ex-mayor of Petrozavodsk, and Emilia Slobunova, the deputy from Karelia, and some other guys, they actually could be a good debater, but they even did not have a part in any debates, and Grigory Yavlinsky took part. Sometimes Schlossberg did, but I guess he made a huge mistake when on his interview on Rain channel he said twice, Crimea is Ukraine, Crimea is Ukraine. So when he said that, he I guess he hit his own party, and I guess this idea about using this rhetoric about Crimea issue was a huge mistake for Yabloko. And also, I would say that Grigory Yavlinsky is a too old-fashioned guy and too obsolete for Russian electorate. So it was a very big mistake to say that this is just the first step for Grigory Yavlinsky presidential campaign. So it was big mistake. So talking about Parnas party, so I say that this idea to forget about any liberal values and say only about hate in Putin's address was a mistake as well. Also, as using xenophobic rhetoric. So when this Maltsev guy called the leader of Liberal Democratic Party, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, old Jew, I would say that some of my friends on liberal flank and some of my beloved Jew friends, of course, they would not vote for this guy after this hate speech. So, and I would say this party of growth, which was headed by Boris Titov, they had a good prospects, but they did not use it. They had a not specific message. They did not understand where they voters and how to achieve them. But I guess that they could have more than 5%, but the campaign was so terrible that so they have a 1 and something percent of the votes. So my idea is that parties on liberal flank, they had possibilities, but unfortunately they did not use it. I say unfortunately because I think that I am the guy with liberal values, and so it's bad for me that no one liberal party is not represented in our parliament, but we have to blame for this only their leaders and their strategic teams.
Okay, thank you very much, Evgeny. It's an old story, unfortunately, the Russian liberal opposition's own inability to unite and to put together a strong campaign. I know you have to go, but do you have time to take 1 or 2 questions?
Yes.
Okay, so if there are any questions just for Evgeny Minchenko right now, let's take those. Yeah, well, if there are no others, then I'll ask Ilya to ask a question.
Zheng, one question for you. You are a famous criminologist, expert on Kremlin hidden moves. Vyacheslav Volodin was elected to Duma, the guy who is the architect of this electoral system. Firstly, do you think that he would actually move to Duma? And secondly, do you think that if he moves, then the functions of the political management of the presidential staff will move with him to Duma, and Duma will finally become an independent institution with a separate political management capabilities?
So there are a lot of rumors, but nobody knows except only one person, Vladimir Putin. I guess maybe.
So you mean Volodin doesn't know this either?
Yeah. Yes, I guess so. So let's see. We just have to wait about 1 month.
Okay, last chance. Any other questions for Yevgeny? All right, Zhenya, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye. See you.
Bye. Okay, now I will actually give the floor to Ilya to talk about whatever he wants to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, what I wanted to say, I want to briefly describe actually the results of the elections. You know, so what are they in numbers, which I think what are the numbers are most relevant and important. So firstly, as you all know, turnout 47%. That means minus 14% from the previous one. So 1/4 of voters that were participating in previous parliamentary elections didn't come this time. That's first important thing. Secondly, United Russia, this is the first time when electoral system worked as half of people got elected in majority districts and half got elected in on party list. For the majority districts, United Russia didn't cover all the majority districts. They delegated 19 actually majority districts to opposition political parties voluntarily and didn't run in those districts. So altogether, United Russia put 206 candidates. Not 225, the overall number of districts. Out of these 206, 203 won. 3 were defeated by communists. All 3 were defeated by candidates from the communists. From those who were running on separated, excluded majority districts, all projected candidates won. So 7 were won by A Just Russia, my former party. 7 were won by the communists. 5 were won by Liberal Democrats. And the first time since long time, 3 candidates were independent. Independent means 2 Kremlin spoiler political parties. Rodina, the leader of that party, was allowed to be elected in Voronezh, and the leader of so-called civil platform. This is the guy who actually raided the party and took it away from Prokhorov, our famous oligarch. Mr. Shamsuddinov was allowed to win in return for this favor in Bashkiria. 1 candidate is formally independent, Vladislav Reznik. He won in Adygea. This is a very interesting case because Vladislav Reznik is the guy who was put on internationally wanted list by Spain police for major money laundering and being a part of mafia with traces to Vladimir Putin personally. So he was allowed to run, but not officially on United Russia, despite he was a long-time member of United Russia and was even chairman of Financial Markets Committee of State Duma as member of United Russia. So he was allowed to run and to win in Adygea also without any resistance. What else is important? From the majority districts, only 1 candidate had real chance to win, it was Dmitry Gudkov, whom we will hear a little bit later. He lost very little bit to a United Russia candidate, but nevertheless lost. With this candidate, it was another interesting phenomenon, which is the first time in Russian elections for a very long time, when overseas votes mattered, because it was a major brain drain from Russia after the annexation of Crimea, which I personally estimate as 1.5 million people left Russia since March 2014. As the result, right now, there are 2 million eligible voters which live outside Russia, which could have come and voted in the embassies and consulate offices. Not so many of them actually came. But it happened that American voters, Russian voters in America, they were linked to the electoral district of Dmitry Gudkov. Of course, Dmitry Gudkov won here with the help of my chief of staff, Anastasia, who is standing there, who was organizing campaign for Dmitry here in the United States, which helped to narrow the gap, but unfortunately not sufficiently to close it completely. Lastly, what I wanted to say in terms of numbers, that all political parties except for United Russia lost their representation in Duma significantly, despite that communists and so-called liberal Democrats, they increased their percentage, but because of the new electoral system, a faction of Communist Party slashed more than half, from 90 seats to 40. A faction of liberal Democrats also by half, from 63 to 32, and the Just Russia from 64 to 23, which is the most loss among all the factions. The major hope of democratic opposition was Yabloko political party, who really created a very strong party list. It was a true democratic coalition based on that party for the first time since the existence of that party, but even core electorate of Yabloko didn't come to vote. In 2011, Yabloko collected almost 2 million votes. This time they collected around 700,000. And in 2011, it was only core electorate of Yabloko, because it was a coalition based on a Just Russia, on my former political party. So that means that those voters should have turned to Yabloko as well this time. That means that the mobilization campaign totally failed, and Kremlin was extremely successful in what they call drying up the turnout. The result in terms of legitimacy of this Duma is that 24% of voters who voted for United Russia now got 76% representation in State Duma, which of course is very, very low. And the last one to say about the legitimacy of the elected Duma, despite that I do agree with Evgeny that voting process per se was more or less transparent. It was better than in previous election, with the exceptions. St. Petersburg was one of the dirtiest regions, unfortunately, in terms of voting process. But the legitimacy is not affected by the counting. The legitimacy is affected by the factor of Crimea. According to all international norms that Russia has ratified and participating, elections on occupied territories should not be recognized. Russian Duma, half of it, as it was elected on the party list, included voting in the Crimea. That means that half of Duma is illegitimate because it included Crimea as the voting place. It was included in the district, plus additional 4 seats were elected exclusively in Crimea. That is that 50% plus 4 seats in Duma are elected illegally. And that's why I personally think, and I call for it officially as a former member of Russian parliament, that this Duma would not be recognized as a legitimate parliament by international community. Lastly, what I wanted to say in general about the result and about the messages and about the support. What we saw during the whole of election campaign, we saw that approval ratings of United Russia were dropping. Their popular support at the beginning of this year was at 60% by all major pollsters. At the end, it was at a level of 40%. Why they got such a large result is because of the reformed electoral system. That's why on this same venue, 3 years ago, I was saying that they will get constitutional majority. It was very well predicted result, but not because of popular support. And this is a major problem for the current regime in Russia, because of course people who are not represented, they will be represented through the street at the end of the day. And in particular in Russia, the threat that it may result in the bloodshed is unfortunately pretty high. Opposition, which tried to exploit political messages during this campaign, and here I also would agree with Evgeny Minchenko, didn't hit what is mostly touching for Russian voters. And Russian voters are concerned about the deepening economic crisis, about the wages, about the prices in the stores, about the utilities, about the roads, about financial independence of regions, about education, about healthcare. These are things which are most important for them. And Yabloko tried to speak about this, and that's why they got the best result. But still it was totally overshadowed by the political messages, and they were not so interesting for the voters during the election. And as Vladimir Putin, I think, absolutely correctly said when he was giving his statement after the results of the elections, he said, United Russia may be not the best party, maybe it does a lot of mistakes, but there is nobody who's better. And this is how Russians actually perceive the situation. Yes, they are bad, they are crooks, they are thieves, they are bureaucrats, they are very distant, but there is nobody who is better. And I do believe that the only alternative is if the opposition would be built on the left flank of the political spectrum and not on the right flank, as all the attempts were made before. As the opposition would feed itself from 1990s, from Yeltsin, from politics, from democracy, from freedom of speech, etc., it will always lose elections, as it would focus on the social and economic issues, then when the chances would reemerge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilya. We were hoping to have Dmitry Gudkov, but apparently we're having technical difficulties, so if at some point he's able to call in, we will give him the floor. But in the meantime, Henry, we've had the 30-foot perspective. Ilya gave us about the 3,000-foot perspective. So turning it over to you now to see if we could get maybe the 30,000-foot perspective.
Yes, I've been asked to talk about kind of the big picture, to contribute at least my interpretation. And so I'll be very interested to hear more from you all as well as from the others in the course of the discussion, which I found very interesting so far. My sense is that kind of thinking big picture, patterns of politics in this part of the world tend to follow long-term cycles of intense periods of contestation and instability and periods of sort of maybe satisfied stability, where people satisfy themselves with lessers of evils, as my colleague just pointed out. I think that the peaks of contestation tend to occur when leaders are facing succession issues, at least when they start to become looming, and that starts to create fissures within the administration themselves as different networks and factions within the leading group start jockeying for position when a leadership might change, and also when these leaders tend to suffer drops in popularity. But I think, in particular in Russia, we saw some tensions like this in 2008 and, of course, in 2011, 2012. These are periods where I think some kind of cracks in the system helped create space for the popular discontent that I think does exist to build up and take on a larger, to take on some larger dimensions. And I think now, sort of thinking where we are now, I think we're sort of at the beginning of a long phase where I think we're sort of in the early parts of the phase where the system is relatively stable so long as the regime operates according to kind of basic competency and manipulates the levers of the system effectively. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And I think that the real tension is likely to emerge, frankly, only once we start approaching 2024, which is when Putin's constitutionally allowed second term starts to run out. And I'm not saying that's because he was going to necessarily abide by the Constitution, but I think that the fact that that exists, I think that lends people to start to expect tensions around that time. And so a lot of what we're seeing now, I think, is political forces jockeying for position, playing a long game. And the first step in that game, I think, will be the 2018 presidential election. So we've already seen in the immediate aftermath of this election a number of people make announcements that they're going to contest the elections or not. So I think that this is kind of a test of strength for the presidential elections, which is what really matters. So for the Putin administration, it's especially important that it gets its mechanism right, its ability to control and get the desired electoral result. So it's a test of both methods and it's a test of strength for the Putin leadership. And so I think in this context, what we can see is that the main result, which is what the other speakers so far basically said, is that I think to some degree the 2011-12 recalibration of the system has largely worked, at least in the short run. Whether or not this will bubble up into discontent in the longer run remains to be seen. So in particular, I have in mind the recalibration that took place along institutional lines and in terms of efforts by the regime to build up its own popular support. So first of all, as Deputy Ponomaryov mentioned, the single-member districts are now effectively the bulwark of support in Parliament for the current leadership. And this goes back to a situation that it effectively existed in 2003, but then as the political machine developed its strength, as it gained popularity, in particular the United Russia as a party was able to potentially clear a majority in the proportional representation, the party list competition by itself. They decided to get rid of the district deputies. And basically this is because district deputies are not completely reliable. It's much better from the perspective of a party leader or a regime leader to have people who are directly beholden to you for their places on the party list and in Parliament, whereas district deputies have at least some opportunity to build up their own personal bases of support that they can then leverage and use for bargaining against the authorities. And this doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go into opposition. They need resources from the center in order to compete, but it's a little harder and more costly for the Kremlin to control these figures. And so the switch back to restore the district elected deputies, which was made right after the 2011 protests, was a reaction to the fact that they anticipated that United Russia was not going to have the levels of popular support that it had once had, that it was weakening, and the anticipation that maybe the economy is not going to recover as much as it would have. So it's kind of a fallback position. They're kind of falling back to the position that they had earlier in the regime, and that I think reflects a tactical shift designed to do exactly what happened, which was United Russia was not capable of winning a supermajority on its own, even with all the might of the administrative resources that the Kremlin team controlled, at least not without just outright banning other parties, which it decided not to do. And so the districts have provided for this. So suddenly you have not only a supermajority necessary for constitutional changes, but over 3/4 of the seats of the Duma now controlled. And again, the vast bulk of this is thanks to the changes in the Duma, in the Duma institutional rules and the creation of the deputies. And I would say, however, I mean, there's certainly some important changes in the nature of these district deputies and the ability and how they fit into the system compared to 2003 when you last had elections to the districts. In 2003, they were much less under control. Certainly, the Kremlin was able to use the deputies that got elected then to cobble together the majorities it needed. But even so, at the point of election, in 2003, there were 98 of the 225 deputies elected this way that were not nominees of a major party. And so, even when they were running for office, they were clinging to their independence, and so they had a lot more. Whereas now, as Mr. Ponomaryov mentioned, basically everybody won that the Kremlin wanted to win in the district. So it's a much more efficient political machine now in terms of getting deputies elected who are going to be more beholden to them. But at the same time, I do see it as something that's a little riskier. But this is an example of how the regime recalibrates in an effort to maintain political control. The second major reform that was adopted after the 2011 protests, or in response to them largely, was a relaxation of the rules for party registration, which allowed the number of parties that were registered to go from 7 to, I don't know how many, over 100 now, I think. And as we see, we have 14 parties that were able to compete in this election. So on one hand, this is liberalization, but on the other hand, it reflects a different way of manipulating the outcome because you have a proliferation of these parties that are effectively sponsored by the regime or certainly facilitated strongly by the regime, like what is it? The Communist Party, Party of Communists, the Party of Pensioners for Justice, which are clearly designed to sap votes from other parties that are not United Russia. And there are a whole host of other parties along these lines that one could point to as well. So effectively, in allowing more parties, it creates opportunities, greater opportunities for splitting the vote when you do go ahead and allow some of the other parties onto the ballot. So I think this election also validates this particular tactic as a strategy for helping to win. Plus, you get more people appearing on television in debates that can attack the parties that you want attacked, and it doesn't have to all come from United Russia. And of course, finally, we have to mention the rescheduling of the elections, which Duma elections have traditionally taken place in December to September, which I think does seem to have contributed to a much lower key campaign, since a lot of it overlapped with summer months when people weren't really thinking about the elections, and part of the result was low turnout. So that's the institutional side, and I'll just very briefly mention, I think, the moves that have been, at least in the short run, a success in terms of ginning up support for United Russia and Putin. Of course, this was after 2011, the move to really push Putin coming back to the presidency as a father of the nation, and really put the emphasis on him personally, even more than they had done in the past. The so-called conservative turn, an appeal to all these different the anti-gay law, the ban on adoptions by Americans, the ban on gay adoptions, the anti-blasphemy law, lots of these things, which actually have large public support, especially outside the big cities. I think this did a lot to help restore the collapsing support of both Putin and United Russia that was taking place after 2011 and the elections there that were something of a disaster for the regime. And finally, of course, we have to mention the Crimea annexation, which did lead to a significant bump in Putin's popularity, which has reflected to some degree on United Russia as well. Now, of course, the support for these different parts of the different arms of the regime, the United Russia ruling party, or the dominant party, I guess I'd put it, Putin, depends on a lot of things. The economy is also clearly very important, and I think we've seen its the party's support wane as a result largely of the economic crisis that's been taking place. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are these other bases of support that United Russia and Putin have tapped into that have given it at least something to work with. So, I think partly, while we definitely are seeing the result of a very effective political machine, cleverly manipulated media, which has been biased and given special opportunities to United Russia as opposed to other parties, according to most analyses that I would call objective. At the same time, it does have something to work with, which I think prevents its support from completely collapsing. And these have to do with associations with certain political views, a sense that the party is competent, or at least more competent than others. And this gets back to the idea of maybe it's kind of a lesser of evils. And it's a catch-22 for opposition parties. They're not allowed to get in power and to actually do something. So after a while, they become seen as removed from the real workings of administration and unable to provide the basic services that people want, even if they may be saying the right things, like in the case of Yabloko. It's been, I don't know how many, over 2 decades since Yavlinsky held an administrative executive office. And so this all creates
26.
dilemmas for the 26, yeah. And so that has effects over time. I think in the end, then, I think what we've seen is a successful recalibration of the political regime since the crisis it faced after 2011. I was saying successful from the regime's perspective. Now the task goes to moving forward. I think it's going to have to find some way to keep maintaining public support in order to maintain its stability over the longer run. My sense is that the 2018 presidential elections is not going to be a major crisis for it, for a variety of reasons that I could go into, unless it makes some major mistakes. I think popular uprisings are possible to challenge it, but my guess is that it's going to ride these out. But I think it starts to enter a danger zone once the 2018 elections start taking place. I mean, maybe they'll be held earlier, too. That's another topic we haven't talked about. In light of the success, maybe they'll hold the presidentials earlier just to kind of get to that next phase. But the next phase, I think, is actually particularly dangerous, and especially if they try to make moves which would allow Putin to stay in office longer. These can become flashpoints for the same or even maybe greater forms of political resistance, like those we saw in 2011 when people were objecting in part to Putin coming back. Even from Medvedev, who wasn't that much of a difference. So let me leave it there, and thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
With the two panelists that we have here, Ilya, I was struck by one of the things you said towards the end, where you talked about how, given the conduct of the elections and the makeup of the current Duma, the likelihood of opposition frustration leading ultimately to bloodshed is significantly higher. And then, Henry, you were talking about moving ahead to 2024 and the possibility of much more intense
they would start from below, from grassroots processes, are way lower than that they would start from the top. And it's a long-standing Russian tradition. And even October Revolution of 1917 started from February Revolution of the same year, which was actually a coup that was orchestrated by the close surrounding of Tsar Nicholas II. I think that the transition process in 2018 may indeed go very smoothly for Vladimir Putin, but in one condition: if international sanctions would be lifted. Russian elites, they are not exactly suffering from the sanctions, but they are very wearisome. And this is a constant threat, especially a threat which is coming from financial institutions. This is a great inconvenience for doing business in the country. There are a lot of minor but very painful things which are associated with those sanctions, so they definitely want them to be lifted. Not that their life depends on it, but really it's inconvenient. And the current promise that Kremlin gives to the elites, that wait a little bit, West is very weak, it's very inconsistent, double standards, we have Syria, we have Brexit, we have elections in the United States. Now it's additional showcase of Kremlin's might in terms of internal elections. Wait a little bit. In 2017, sanctions would be lifted. We'll be back to business as usual. And Russia would re-emerge as more powerful player, not as a weaker player in terms of international community. And unfortunately, I think that this calculation is very close to actually happen. So I think that if this would happen, then 2011, no protests, no unrest, no split within the elites. Yes, we will go until either the economy will collapse, which I believe would not happen in the near future, because still Russia is very powerful in terms of oil and gas, in terms of metals, in terms of diamonds, coal, whatsoever, any kind of natural resources. They always would be sold for hard currency. The modern day world has deficit in natural resources. We have China as alternative consumer of them. We have Europe, which anyway would need especially natural gas, and that would help this regime to sustain. And whatever problems we would have, they would result in higher prices, they would result in devaluation of ruble, but that all will be blamed on United States and on bloody imperialists and foreign threat. And Putin is the only savior from those outside threats. And that would actually work to reinforce his regime and not to weaken him. So the only way to achieve changes in Russia, it's number one, to be consistent and honest in all the messages, and to match words with deeds. And secondly, is about Ukraine, because that's also what Russians inevitably are looking at because of the relatives and because of the proximity of the country and the language and etc. If Ukraine would start reforming for better, finally, and it would be seen as that the revolution and Western influence can generate some good for the common people and for their personal wallets, then it would affect Russian constituents as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very interesting question. I guess my sense is that, of course, protests are possible. Protests can break out for a lot of reasons, and sometimes you have small protests that start to cascade into larger ones. Say, if the economy really does start to perform much worse than it currently is, But at the same time, my sense is that, again, while I think maybe rule number one for certainly a analyst of Russia based outside is not to be too confident in one's own predictions about what's going to happen in Russia, my guess is that the current administration in Russia is in a very good position to survive significant protests and to somehow find a way to engineer a win in the 2018 presidential elections. I mean, first of all, right now, I think Putin's popularity levels are such that you'd likely see that in any case, even with a significant liberalization. But even if even if one assumes that that glow from Crimea is going to fade and that economic problems start to weigh against the popularity of the leader, we see lots of regimes that are able to survive in power due to other methods and manipulations of the political system, even when they're quite unpopular. And I just don't see Putin's popularity collapsing to the level by 2018, certainly, that it would be necessary for him to lose this election. But again, you can never rule things out. Sometimes leaders make big mistakes. Again, I wouldn't expect, but I just don't expect 2018 to be much more dramatic than this election currently was. Of course, I think then moving forward, one has to think about what could come next. And I think for Mr. Putin, he has to think about a lot of things, including, even if we think about succession in terms of constitutional term limits and think, well, okay, he can easily sidestep those somehow. Father time is approaching, right? I mean, by that time, he's going to be in his 70s. These are times that start getting perilous for leaders. And so he's going to have to start thinking about the future of his family and his friends. Sometimes we see leaders enact reforms designed to constrain their successors. So that would be the optimistic scenario, I think, for Russia, which would be some kind of constitutional reforms that take place. This certain supermajority in the Duma certainly won't hurt that possibility, which would be designed to weaken whoever came after Putin. And again, I'm not predicting that this is likely, but I think there are a number of scenarios that we could see as being at least worth considering as we move forward in the future. I guess I think that some political turmoil is possible, especially if the economy continues to spiral downward, or if the regime makes significant mistakes. But I don't see a real serious bout of instability occurring, until until much later, I'd say several years down the line, well after this next re-election.
Okay, let's throw it open to questions. Please, we have microphones. Yes, we have microphones. Please wait for one. Identify yourself, state your affiliation, and please do ask a question.
Hi, thanks very much. Very interesting. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've had the opportunity to monitor elections in the former Soviet Union republics. In fact, I've just come from one. So I have a couple of questions. Some of them are from ignorance, but I'll ask them anyway. In some countries, there is, first of all, mandatory voting. It's pretty clear this wasn't the case. But in some countries as well, precinct election commissions kind of check up on people, encourage them that day to vote, and so on. I want to know if this happens in Russia. That's one. I'm wondering if Mr. Gorbachev had anything to say prior to the election. I regret I don't really read the Russian press, so I don't know, but some of you do, and you might be able to enlighten me. And the third question is about the role of deputies in the Duma. Is it anything like, at least ideally, we have when their representatives respond to constituents' problems? I'm talking here about very grassroots problems. There are potholes. Such and such state agency isn't working very well. Do deputies ever meet with their constituents? If you could enlighten me on some of these nitty-gritty grassroots questions.
Okay, so what do parties or the United Russia, the administration, do to goose turnout, Gorbachev, and then what do Duma deputies actually do?
I will start from the second one. Thanks God Gorbachev didn't participate in the elections and did say nothing about them. Because this guy, in terms of Russians, he has like an anti-Midas touch. You know, if he supports somebody, you know, it would be immediately ruined. So he basically lives right now his private life, travels internationally. His health is right now not that good. But still he tries to, whenever possible, to travel and to speak at different occasions in other countries. But in Russia, he is genuinely hated. If he would be up for elections, he would not have even 0.1% of popular support. In terms of how deputies work, so I was MP for 9 years. I always tried to be as close to my constituents as possible, despite that I was elected on the party list from Novosibirsk, the capital of Siberia. Novosibirsk region, it's a huge region. So for you to understand the scale, it's some 500 miles wide and some 300 miles in terms of height on the map. So I traveled a lot. I was primarily elected with the votes in the rural part of the region. The region is split half and half between the city and rural areas. And we somehow, like, we had an informal agreement with communists because this region is very left-wing. It's very opposition-minded, and we decided that we shouldn't actually violate each other. And so they were focusing more on the city, and I was focusing more on rural areas, despite that I was chairing the innovation subcommittee, and Novosibirsk is the capital of Russian innovations, Russian Academy of Sciences, and actually that's how I moved to Novosibirsk in the first place. But still, I was more focused on the rural areas. So, of course, I had a lot of meetings with people during the campaign, in between campaigns, in my everyday work. I had a network of my political aides who are working in the region. I was one of top 5 deputies in the Russian parliament in terms of number of documents which are being issued to support different people needs. The bulk of them is different, I would say, defense measures, because when people feel powerless in front of their local attorneys or local police officers, or when they had problems with their pensions, with other municipal, regional, federal agencies, they usually were coming to me as an opposition deputy because they knew that I could bring media attention to it and generally pressure, and bureaucrats don't like being in the spotlight. That's why they in many cases we managed to resolve the problems, and that's what the network of aides is doing. More, I was expanding my network beyond Novosibirsk. Altogether, by law, I have 45 political aides. They are not paid, it's voluntary work, but from them I have around 20 in the region, and others, they are scattered across the country. So I was receiving different requests and claims and letters from other regions, and I was working with them as well. In general, Russian deputies, they have a privilege of having their tickets, whatever they are, air, train, bus, whatsoever, paid by the state. So I could travel a lot, and I was using this opportunity. I was always on the move in the country, visiting different regions and talking to people. United Russia deputies, by the way, are also doing the same. Not all of them, because they understand that their mandates, they are not coming from the people, but from the superiors. But still, some of them want to be useful. and some of them are normal people who justify their presence in United Russia, that they're actually helping people, that they are voting for terrible laws, but on the other hand, they are helping particular people. And they also do work with the constituents, although in United Russia, I would estimate that's maybe like 1/5 of their deputies actually do work with people. For United Russia, it's slightly easier because they have access to resources and they can talk to local governor or to local mayor because they're all members of the same party. So for them, it's easy to solve problems. For opposition, it's way harder, but they can do it. The difference from Congress people here in the United States is that in Russia, in theory, Duma passes the budget, so it has influence over state appropriations, but that's in theory. In practice, it's all been done within the government, and in, for example, 1990s, even communists, which were in the opposition all the time, could influence the budget, and that was the source of their influence, because people knew that they can lobby for a bridge, they can lobby for a road, they can lobby for additional appropriations for the region, for the municipality, for whatever. Now we cannot do it. So we can like campaign for it, you know, we can talk about it, but that's not something that we can actually deliver. And this is a sort of frustration. It's one of the sort of sources of popularity for United Russia, because they always stress that we at least can fix you the roof on the school, because we are buddies with the governor, and you know, if we talk to the governor will give you money and he will fix you the school. And if you vote for those bastards, you know, you will never get money for the school. And it was a reported case on the recent regional campaign in Samara region, when the governor was coming to some village where a new road was constructed. And he felt like people are not greeting him with proper enthusiasm. And he said, if you will not greet me properly, I will ruin the road. And people took it absolutely seriously. You know, that was in all the media. You know, it was a lot of anger, but that's how people actually feel.
In the back.
Yeah, and in terms of stimulating the turnout, every time they were doing it before, because traditionally in Russia, high turnout was the source of legitimacy. And always, all those local precincts, you know, all those local people, usually they're linked with schools, they were campaigning, calling, you know, doing their best to make sure that people will come and vote. And in these elections, that was the first time, they actually were hiding. There were reports that people couldn't find their polling station because they were moving, you know, and they did their best so that people will not come, that it's only authorized people will come to vote. People who are employed with the local utility companies, you know, local construction workers, local budget workers, so those who are under control.
Hi, I'm Sam Rebo from Eurasia Group. My question is, what's the game plan going forward for the liberal opposition in Russia? What plans do you have to gain support again? And is there any discussion of uniting groups like Parnas and Yabloko?
Probably also for me. Firstly, I think that the current opposition is hopeless. And in this situation, these results, while they are deeply disappointing, they may have a very healthy effect at the end of the day. Because according to Russian legislation, if you are getting lower than 3%, you are not eligible for state funding, which Yabloko was enjoying for years. And you also have to collect signatures when putting your candidates on the local elections. Also, that was a privilege that was source of some, very modest, but still some donor funding for the same Yabloko and some others. Right now, it's all lost. So it's basically a blank sheet of paper to create something new. The major problem is that media attention is focused on people from the liberal part of the opposition, and in Russian understanding, liberal means right liberal. It means new liberal. It doesn't mean left liberal, rather that it is in United States, for example. To my mind, only opposition force which is positioned as left liberal, as social democratic opposition, as socialist opposition, only that opposition has chances. I totally against any sort of populism, but from the other side, if you are in the opposition and you're saying that we are for the unpopular market reforms, you would not get many votes. At least you should say something which is popular, and that's about real problems that Russians do have. It's about healthcare, education, this kind of things. This is our most top issues on the agenda, and people who are associated with the opposition right now, even murdered Boris Nemtsov, they were the people who were drafting these reforms at the very first place. So you cannot expect them to be popular. Their negative support is way higher than any of the United Russia people. So it has to be built from the scratch. And that's why also I'm saying that I think that the changes would start from the top. Because, of course, Putin is enjoying very high popular support. But his mistakes can be carefully engineered by his own surrounding, because they are playing the king. And I'm 100% sure if they would decide to do so, that then Putin support would start to collapse pretty rapidly. And they would open the gates, so to say. None of them can name a candidate which would be a popular, people's candidate. They can name a figure which can be the successor for Putin. But most likely it would be a figure like Dmitry Medvedev, who would be weak and the kind of compromise between everybody. And that would give the possibility for a new leader to emerge. But again, I'm 100% sure that this leader would come either from the left or, God forbid, from the nationalist part of the spectrum. So I would fight my best for this guy to be from the left. But nationalists also would have chance, but liberals, no.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. My name is Tori Tausig, and I'm from the Brookings Institute. And Ilya, to follow up on your point earlier about the sources of instability most likely emerging from the top, I wanted to ask you more broadly about the idea of legitimacy in the Putin era. And first off, what are the sources of legitimacy of this regime? And then from what groups or kind of elites at the top specifically does he seek to maintain legitimacy and stability with? And then how do we see the events of kind of the 2011, 2012 elections, kind of Crimea, and then these most recent elections as illustrating what that kind of legitimacy looks like and where it emerges from? Thank you.
I don't want to eat the bread of Henry, but speaking in terms of political science, the current regime can be best described as Bonapartist regime, like Louis Bonaparte III in France. And the legitimacy of this kind of regimes is coming from legitimacy of the leader. It's this regime's strength, and this is the Achilles tendon of this regime. As long as Putin would be strong, whatever is happening within the country, local elections, regional elections, federal elections, appointments, they all would be illegitimate in people's eyes, because they take them all as fraction of Putin's aura and Putin's power. So in this situation, it can last for a very long time. During these elections, I know different Russian regions very well, but when I was exploring all the single mandates candidates who actually won their majority districts during these elections, probably 80% I don't know, because they don't matter. You can name dogs, cats, horses, they would be the same in the same degree legitimate in people's eyes. That's why I was talking about Crimea and about the legitimacy which is coming from in terms of law and not on the terms of legitimacy as people's legitimacy. Because really this is the first time when there is a major violation of international law in the foundation of this parliament. And if the West would decide to dig in this direction, which I doubt, but if it will, that would result in major problems for Putin and his power. Because at the end of the day, Duma is being used not to increase the legitimacy of the regime in general, but to consolidate the elites by giving them a seat, by giving them status, by giving them recognition, by giving them feeling that they are part of this consolidated power. So Duma is a mechanism how to include regional elites in the overall construction. And if they would see that this construction bears additional risks for them personally, then it would be seen not as a strength, but as a weakness. And I, in general, again, returning to the issue of sanctions, that's what I was saying for a very long time, that I think that economic sanctions, in the way they were introduced from the very beginning, they were a mistake, because they helped to consolidate common people around Putin, because they helped Putin to explain that all their personal problems are associated with the West. But personal sanctions should have been way more severe and should be extended way further than they were originally introduced. And these elections are actually a very good chance to reconsider this approach and to think more about it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a couple things. I think legitimacy is a difficult question, because there are different definitions. To some extent, something becomes legitimate just because people expect it to continue, and I think that actually is a part of it. It's just the expectation that the current system is going to continue leads people to discount possible alternatives or just not take them seriously. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. But I guess I would highlight a few things. One, I think you're right that the potential for opposition is not really so great on the right. But partly I think that's because the current authorities, Putin and United Russia, have sort of co-opted that room for opposition. Because they're associated in public opinion polls. If you ask people, where on a 10-point scale of left to right does the current system, United Russia or Putin, lie? They place them on the right. And so they see them as sort of a market-oriented alternative to the Yeltsin-era reformers who did all these bad things and destroyed the economy. So there's not a whole lot of room. And the Kremlin has been very careful to prevent others from encroaching on that part of what United Russia goes for. Of course, it also goes for a wide range of public appeals and makes coalitions with left and right. But I think, probably somewhere in that moderate, not the kind of extreme far right, far more market-oriented areas where it's going to be. But I think that also is part of its appeal, is that it appeals to sort of a pragmatic generally market-oriented approach that a large number of people, can be made to accept. I think also we find, the economy I already mentioned. I think the economic legitimacy is very important. The fact that the economy improved dramatically during the 2000s, at least, for a lot of people, saw improvements in their lives, across Russia, not just in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so that matters. And so that's one reason it's facing problems now, is the slowing of the economy, of course. There have been traditional certain demographic appeals that it's made, which we can talk about the sources of, which are always interesting. Women tend to support Putin in particular, more united Russia, more strongly than men. If you ask them in polls, they're controlling for other things. They're more likely to vote for it. Smaller communities, there are appeals to smaller communities opposed to the urban areas, as we know. And so I think there are a variety of bases upon which the regime gains support. And again, support isn't necessarily legitimacy. And again, I think it's also all within the context of the regime shaping this perception of alternatives and kind of really creating the impression that the other alternatives are just not viable, whether or not you might like them in the real world. So I think that's the possibility of change happens when something really shakes the expectations of people, when they start to think that something else might be possible. And I think that was one of the big powerful things that happened in 2011 with the protests, was suddenly people started to think, well, wait a minute, maybe we can have an alternative future. And so that just opened up the space for a lot of people to be thinking about real political change. And it was a real crisis for the regime, which then overcame it, I think. But I think it was a period of great uncertainty. And so certainly a moment like that could arise in the future. So legitimacy can be kind of a fragile thing as well, because so much of it hinges on what people expect to happen, and what people expect to happen can be impacted by a lot of very circumstantial factors.
Governments are legitimate until they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm Kate Boffman. I'm a graduate student over at Georgetown at CSIS. And I was kind of surprised by the fact that this year Russian nationals abroad were allowed to vote. And you had mentioned that this was having to do with the large brain drain. And I was wondering, I got the impression that maybe it wouldn't be the case that the support and proportional support for the various parties was the same among these Russian nationals abroad. And if not, if perhaps alternative parties to United Russia receive more support among this particular sector, why would they decide to institute this new policy where people abroad could vote?
No, it's not a new policy. Actually, Russians abroad could always vote. It's just that their number hasn't increased dramatically. Because previous waves of immigration, people were living for good, and they were changing their citizenship. Right now, they are living, but they retain Russian passports. So they want just to stay outside Russia, but they are still Russian citizen. And the only important thing that changed is that, again, previously the overall number was so small that all Russian nationals in all countries, they were usually linked to one particular electoral district in Russia, the one which is more deficient in terms of number of votes, to balance the number of voters in every district. Right now, almost every single different consulate office in different countries is linked to a different electoral district, because these numbers can seriously change the result of the elections. For example, if whatever opposition candidate we would be putting, if everybody would be all overseas stations would be linked to one district, this guy would be guaranteed in the Duma. And even with Gudkov, we thought that number of votes in the United States alone, and not all of the United States. United States had, I believe, 13 or 14 polling stations. For Gudkov it was just 4, but we thought it would be already enough to get him in the Duma. They even made some last-moment changes in the embassy, because originally New York was supposed to be voting for Gudkov, and that's one of the largest Russian audiences, so they decided to cut New York out and give other districts so to decrease support for Gudkov. But it's a totally new phenomenon that people were campaigning. And in terms of preferences, I don't have yet the official results. But in the United States, I'm 100% certain that Yabloko was number 1. I know that, for example, in Washington, D.C., Yabloko was number 1 and Gudkov was number 1. And my observation in Boston was exactly the same, and I guess that in most other places it would be the same. European Russians, they most likely voted differently, because they had strong organizations which are linking them to the current authorities in Russia. And most likely their vote was at least split for and against Unite Russia. But in the United States, the support was predominantly for the opposition.
Okay, this is probably about a good spot to end on then. So any concluding thoughts? Any surprises ahead for the Duma that's now going to be seated? Or are we now just have a clear path to 2018?
As I said, I don't think that we have clear path. I think that this road would be pretty bumpy. And there are a lot of uncertainties. There are things which can be done to influence the situation. I don't have high hopes that it would be a consistent policies on behalf of Western nations, unfortunately. But there is a strong possibility to achieve things and to influence the situation in Russia. Of course, it's all up to us Russians. And there are people who are position-minded. And there are a lot of them. Right now, they feel abandoned and they feel orphaned. And they don't feel that there is any kind of force that can consolidate them. And that's why they are not coming for the elections. People don't want to be lone fighters. They want to be part of a certain force. And right now, there is only one force in Russia, which is Vladimir Putin. And here I think that Russian diaspora would play a significant role. It can influence to construct this force. But we also need your support in terms of forming the public opinion and to abandon the idea of supporting the old-timers of 90s, despite that they may speak better English, than some new generation guys, especially from the left or nationalist flanks, which may be coming. They may be more pleasant, more accustomed with better connections here in DC, but at the end of the day, I think it's our common interest to have the situation in Russia changed, and it's in the interest of global security. It's in the interest of European security, and of course, it's in the interest of common Russians.
Yeah, maybe just a couple. I think probably this Duma is not going to act a whole lot differently from the other one, the previous one that's just moving out of office. Although I think it will be interesting to see if the district deputies start behaving differently somehow, to see if they actually do represent a tighter link to their constituencies than did the representatives on average of the previous Duma. I don't expect a major difference there, just because I think the Duma has its place in the system, and I don't think this changes it. If anything, this just kind of reinforces the administration's control over the Duma. And I think the main kind of thing is coming next. I think the presidential campaign effectively begins now. People have been thinking about it before now, but I think now is when you're going to start seeing a lot of direct actions aimed at influencing the 2018 elections. And probably the first element of intrigue will just be, will the administration decide to capitalize on this relative success to move up the time of the election? So now it's scheduled for March of 2018, but it's possible they might want to not take a chance on the economy getting any worse, or at least getting much worse, and go ahead and move things up and shift on to the next stage. Of course, that only brings the next election even closer. So I'm not sure that would be a good move from their perspective. But at least now I think there is a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not something like this might happen. So as far as things to look for, that's what I'll be interested to see, I think, kind of most immediately. But thank you.
Okay, thanks again to our panelists, and thanks again to all of you for coming out here. You can see the difficulties at generating turnout here in this room, but so congratulate yourselves for making it. And
it's the
thanks
same
again.
40%, you know.
Yeah.
Recording has stopped.